Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Ramani here. Good morning from the United States and good whatever, wherever you are. Welcome to this Facebook Live where I'm going to answer, I hope, all the things you want to know about narcissism I can in an hour. I'm really happy to be here with Stuff That Works, a team that I work with, and it's a website that actually does something really innovative. They get data based on real people's experiences. And those real people could be you if you go to their website and check it out. They collect data based on real people's experiences, and they use that to collect data on people's experiences on a variety of chronic conditions, medical conditions, mental health conditions. And then they use that to just tell you, based on the data, what people's experiences are with the treatments that work and that don't work. And it's live, it's constantly shifting. So it's a dynamic, real place to get real information about what works for people with a variety of chronic health conditions. Their website, and it'll appear throughout this live, is StuffThatWorks.health. Go check it out. And again, I'm actually also very honored to work with their team and informing a lot of their content on narcissistic abuse, which what we're going to talk about today. So do check out their website. And again, they're a rare health website that actually has a section on narcissistic abuse. And so I really tip my hat to actually being willing to address that. A lot of mental health sites don't take that on. So let's talk. Let's answer some questions, because that's what today is about. Answering questions that people actually went ahead and put in to Stuff That Works by being a part of that community. They had the opportunity to put their questions there. And at the end of this live, I'll be answering some of your questions that may come in during this live event. So let's start at the top. And the nice thing is, just to throw in another aside, as I answer these questions, the people at Stuff That Works are actually going to share data that they've collected. Again, this is dynamic data that's getting updated all the time. And the graphics you see will actually be data that complements the questions I'm answering. So you'll see how it all actually kind of tracks. What I've observed clinically is definitely what's being supported by the data. So let's go ahead and begin and take a look at this first question. So the first question today is that narcissistic abuse is not considered a medical condition, yet victims or survivors experience a very distinct set of symptoms. How do you explain that? So this is something that we're sort of trying to figure out in this field and really trying to document in a very consistent way what happens to people who are survivors of these narcissistic, sort of high conflict, antagonistic, difficult relationships. Because if there's one thing we're seeing, is that the patterns that survivors experience are pretty darn consistent across everyone. Leading the call are symptoms like confusion, anxiety, self-doubt, helplessness, hopelessness, powerlessness. And yet on the flip side, what we see is that a lot of this symptomatology, if you will, or these patterns resolve when people get good information. So you can see here on the graphic that when people are experiencing, who are subjectively saying, I'm going through narcissistic abuse, the things that sort of lead the call are things like anxiety, depression, negative impacts on esteem, symptoms consistent with PTSD and complex PTSD. And these are often things like being more vigilant, being more on edge, having a lot of re-experiencing, going through a lot of rumination. There is a lot of fear. So when you go down this list, I'd love for all of you to also reflect, if you are going through narcissistic abuse, does your experience really sort of track with what you're seeing here? And you can see that the patterns we see in narcissistic abuse, if you look at the top of the graph, they're also quite consistent with other mental health patterns we see, for example, like depression or generalized anxiety disorder. That might be very well why, if you went to go get therapy and you were experiencing narcissistic abuse, the tendency was for a clinician to say, it looks like you have generalized anxiety, which may very well be true. But in addition to that, you're having this very unique experience around narcissistic abuse for which we know education and realistic expectations makes a real impact. I want to say one last thing about this, though. I don't know that I want to turn abuse into an illness per se, because once again, we run the risk of pathologizing survivors. I actually think that the patterns that survivors of narcissistic abuse go through are what I would consider to be expectable reactions to this kind of confusion. When somebody's manipulating you and gaslighting you and devaluing you and invalidating you, you would expect someone to become anxious and sad and fearful and confused. That is a normative reaction. In my work, and I'm hoping in some of the information you'll get through Stuff That Works and in my partnership with them, my work has always been focused on getting information out to people so they stop blaming themselves. It's interesting how often we put all the symptomatology and sort of the pathology on the people who are going through it, and we don't put enough of a lens on the people who are actually the narcissistic abusers. So that's something to think about, right? So let's go to the next question. I hope I answered that one and made sense. So the next question is, how does narcissistic behavior start? So sort of what are the origins of narcissism and narcissistic behavior? What causes people to become narcissists? I'm going to give you as simple an answer as I can to this rather complicated developmental question. Right now, none of the data supports the idea that somebody is born narcissistic. Now, babies may seem selfish, but that's not what we mean. It's not as though it's inevitable that somebody's born and they're going to become narcissistic. By and large, what the literature suggests, the theoretical literature suggests, is that narcissism is very likely an attachment issue. So people who go on to show narcissistic behavior in adulthood likely had some disruption in their early environment. It might have been chaos, it might have been unpredictability, it might have been inconsistency, or even unavailable or non-responsive caregiving. Even if parents were available, they may simply not have been engaged or interested or responsive to that child. We also know that in a subset of people who are narcissistic adults, there may be trauma in childhood. Now, this is where it gets tricky. Not all adult narcissists have trauma histories in childhood, and most people who have trauma histories in childhood will not go on to become narcissistic. So like I said, I'm kind of giving you a bucket of the whole range of things that could place a person at vulnerability for developing adult narcissistic patterns. Another pattern that can come up is what I call overindulgence and underindulgence, both kind of happening at the same time. By overindulgence, I might mean sort of spoiling a child. They get what they want when they want. There's really no rules. There's no sort of behavioral expectations. But when that child has any kind of an emotional need or wants to talk about their feelings or have their feelings responded to, nobody's really interested. There's a lot more interested in rules, order, or even just giving the child things or even experiences, fancy holidays and fancy, they live in a nice place, but their other needs, their emotional needs are not nurtured. There are also other issues, like what I also call the performing pony model of where narcissism comes from. And by that, I mean children who are almost completely rewarded for accomplishment, achievement, or other things like how they look. So the child is consistently told, you're so beautiful, you're so cute, you're such a good soccer player, such a great student. And the parents almost derive their narcissistic supply from the child's achievement or appearance. The child's on the stage and the parent is almost taking in the glory on that. Now, here's the problem. At some point, that child may not be as cute or look the way they want them to, or not do as well in school, or not be interested in that sport or something like that. And when the child recognizes that really the parent's love comes when they're doing what the parent wants them to do, that can also create an emptiness that goes forward into adulthood narcissism. And also that we have to pay attention to something we call modeling. A child who has a narcissistic parent could be at risk for learning some of those behaviors from the narcissistic parent. So if they see a parent consistently behaving in an entitled way, demanding things of people, yelling at people, thinking that they're somehow special and the rules don't apply to them, or being very dysregulated or any of that, it's possible that that also can place a person for risk at ongoing adult narcissism. Now, here's the challenge. The majority of people with narcissistic parents actually don't go on to become narcissistic. They go on to actually become quite anxious. So as you can see, there are no guarantees. It's sort of all of these things place a person at risk. And then you throw society into there. This is a kid who's actually getting reinforced for this behavior. Their society is reinforcing this behavior in the child, their entitled behavior, their dysregulated behavior, their lack of empathy. A culture can support that too. And so this is a far more complex thing than just what happens in early childhood. It has to intersect with what's happening in the world at large. And so this really comes down to then early childhood issues and really creating spaces where children have safe spaces to talk about emotions and feel that emotions are a valid part of the human experience. So let's go to the next question. So next question is, what is the best way to break the trauma bond? Based on the data from StuffThatWorks members, and again, please do check out that website at StuffThatWorks.health. Based on the data from StuffThatWorks members, and research and education are found to be the most effective treatments. Why do you think that is? So the concept of the trauma bond, and it's again, complicated question I'm going to try to answer simply, is that early relationships and those sort of bonded early relationships, which are essential to survival, when those are characterized by things like chaos, unpredictability, and abuse, for the child, that then creates this very unfortunate calculus where abuse almost equals love or abuse equals relationship. That schema then trails into adulthood. So when a person encounters relationships characterized by abandonment and chaos and instability and people who are out and who are in, who are invalidating, basically who resemble those early childhood relationships, it almost bonds the relationship more. Again, it's almost the simple math is abuse equals love. And when we see in trauma bonded relationships is these are people in these relationships justify and rationalize what's happening in the relationship all the time. You keep having the same conversation over and over again. There's lots of breaking up and getting back together, breaking up and getting back together, as though you're almost playing out that childhood adult attachment piece. So how do you break this? Part of it is to really get it, to understand it. I think for many people, and as you can see here in this graphic, for the majority of people, just understanding it, like, this is a thing, I'm actually doing this, can be an eye-opener. And a person will say, yeah, I'm caught in this cycle where we're constantly breaking up, getting together, that there's lots of chaos. And in fact, that almost feels familiar to me. Why? It resembles my childhood. It resembles my early relationships. So once we kind of get that into place, that that's a thing, many people say, well, I don't want that to be a thing. One of the simplest ways to start addressing the trauma bond is to stop justifying. I always say that, and this is a quick little fix, I want you to stop using the word but, and I want you to start using the word and. The way cognitive dissonance and justification works in a narcissistic relationship is we don't like the idea that I'm in a relationship with someone I love, they're abusing me. That doesn't add up, does it? So we'll often say, I'm in a relationship with someone I love, they're abusing me, but they're under a lot of stress, but their father was very mean to them, but they don't really mean it, right? See, then we make all the pieces fit. If you take that but out and just keep it as an and, I'm in a relationship with someone and they are abusive and they are invalidating and they are manipulative, you have to tolerate that and that's uncomfortable. But the more you tolerate the and, the more you see it clearly, and then you can make some decisions. Even if you decide to stay in the relationship, you might say, I'm in this relationship and it is really quite abusive. It's less about then justifying and almost turning it into something in your mind that it's not, and allowing that kind of passive unconscious trauma bonded cycle to continue. But understanding it, connecting it to the past. And then there is a moment in time when people will say, once I tried to break out of this trauma bonded cycle, I actually had to get comfortable with relationships that almost felt a little bit unexciting and untriggering. And that's the issue, is that when these relationships aren't triggering, people say, well, this can't be love. Maybe there's no chemistry. And I'm like, I don't like that word chemistry in relationships, because for too many people, chemistry actually equals trauma bond. And I say, that's okay. Start with a friendship. It doesn't have to be fireworks and chaos. And especially for people with histories of trauma bonded childhoods with very inconsistent parents or very neglectful or invalidating parents, a really slow start in adult relationships becomes a big piece of it. And a final sort of Dr. Ramani tip I'm going to throw in there for you. One thing I really encourage my clients to do, and if you've ever been in my workshops, I talk about this at length, is to make what I call an ick list. Ick, like, oh, ick. Ick lists are all the terrible things that happened in your narcissistic relationship. It's actually not a pleasant experience. You may want to do it with a friend or something so it doesn't feel so awful, but write them all down. The reason I'm having you do this is when you feel like justifying the relationship, you need to look at that list and say, oh, it's almost like seeing a picture of yourself at a very unflattering moment, but here it's a picture of the relationship. And you're saying, no, 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 this is not okay. But when you don't write it down, one of the big issues in narcissistic relationships is something called euphoric recall. Euphoric recall, which is where we remember things as better than they were. And so, especially if you get some distance from the narcissistic relationship, you kind of forget. And if you don't have it written down, you are like, no, no, it was fine. And then you remind yourself there's that list, or a friend reminds you, remember that list? And you look at it, that can also help with that trauma bond. So I hope those things help answer that question. So let's go to the next question. So StuffThatWorks data, and remember, I'm really encouraging you, please go check out their website, StuffThatWorks.health. StuffThatWorks data shows that only 27% of members report having found an effective treatment for narcissistic abuse. That's compared to 40% in the clinical depression community and 47% in the generalized anxiety disorder community. PTSD is even higher with 32%. Why do you think that is? So I think that is because we haven't been yet able to build an evidence base around treatment for narcissistic abuse. One of the other things I do in my career is I try to train therapists and coaches on how to do this, like how to work with survivors. And I think a big problem is the majority of clinicians out there, the majority of people working with people from, who have been through narcissistic abuse actually don't get this. There's actually a tremendous risk of telling people, well, all relationships are hard. Maybe you should work on communication. And I'm like, they could do anything. They could have it tattooed on their forehead. They could have a neon sign. They could have it sky written in the sky. The narcissistic partner or person in their life is not listening and is not going to hear them. And so I think as a result of this, it's almost created a bit of a blind spot in people's understanding. So people in good faith will go to therapy and the therapist actually doesn't know about narcissistic abuse. So again, that's a big foundation of my work. And I think that's a big reason because we've been doing research on depression and GAD and even PTSD for a long time. And so as a result, we have more data on that. We know what works better there. The challenge with narcissistic abuse is that when a person is in a narcissistically abusive relationship, we have to make a leap of faith, don't we, right? So a client comes into my office and tells me about their problematic marriage. And they tell me about patterns like devaluation, invalidation, minimization, gaslighting, the entitlement, the rage. They tell me all of that. It's pretty clear to me what's going on, but let's face it, I don't have their partner in the room with me. I don't work with couples where somebody's narcissistic. It feels like I'm just taking people's money when there's no point, right? So I can only go on good faith, but I know the pattern my client is experiencing. And I say, okay, let's break it down. And I say, I can't diagnose this person your partner. I don't never met them, but these patterns sound consistent with what we call narcissism. And then I can give them realistic expectations on, have you tried this? Can we do this? And many times my clients come in armed with text messages and emails and recordings. It's pretty unmistakable what's happening. But because it involves something that's not happening in the room fully, like it's happening because of something being done to them, what's happening in this relationship, that's where it gets a little bit tricky in a therapeutic space. But in working with clients, and I want more therapists to learn this, it's about educating the clients. It's about doing grief work with clients. It's about understanding the other psychosocial issues that are raised. It's about teaching about realistic expectations. But I think we're still trying to do the research. This is where StuffThatWorks becomes a really important resource. They're actually out there in real time getting this data. Here's what gets really interesting. 16% of people who are survivors of narcissistic abuse have reported experiencing actually a detrimental treatment or a treatment they felt did more harm than good. And I remember when I first met with the StuffThatWorks team, it was a while ago, and they showed me this data. I was like, how interesting, because look at what that top line is. couples counseling. And that both broke my heart and also did not surprise me, because I'm sure some of you are on this live saying, yep, I went through couples therapy with my narcissistic partner, and I heard a lot of, maybe you aren't listening well enough. Maybe your anxiety is getting on their nerves. Maybe you aren't communicating clearly enough. Why don't you have date night? I'm like, date night? This person's doubting this person's reality, and all you're coming up with is date night? And so people were getting the kinds of guidance you would give to a very different kind of a very different kind of a couple. It was like giving people, I don't know, chemotherapy for the common cold. Like, it didn't make sense. It wasn't going to work here. And actually, it was going to make people worse. And so I think that the couples therapy, and this is why I actually am very, very reluctant to even ever suggest that. As a rule, I don't tend to suggest couples therapy to people who are going through narcissistically abusive relationships unless I have a phenomenal referral for couples therapy, because so often couples therapy is based on both people are responsible in the relationship. That really fortifies that pattern of self-blame that we see in survivors. So I found that interesting. Another thing that you saw in that prior graphic there was also people saying that they were offered things like antidepressants and they didn't feel that that made a difference. That would actually make sense. Now, there are many survivors out there of narcissistic abuse who also have co-occurring depression. And obviously in that case, we want to manage the depression, right? We want to give them evidence-based treatments for depression. In some cases, that involves medication. We want to do all of that. However, to only treat the depression and not address the narcissistic abuse means that we're missing the primary stressor, which is actually probably making those mood symptoms, those depressive symptoms, a little bit worse. And so I think that this is why everyone out there in the healthcare field, especially those giving mental health services, need to understand this. And like I said, Stuff That Works is really innovative as being sort of the front line of people who are actually gathering some important data on this. So let's go to the next question. So in this question we have, can you explain the differences between an overt and a vulnerable narcissist? In fact, I'll probably put this, can you explain the differences between a grandiose and a vulnerable or a covert narcissist? And what are your recommendations for dealing with each type? So let's talk briefly about these differences. I mean, the words like grandiose and overt narcissists are often used interchangeably. In general, grandiose is probably the preferred term. And then it can be vulnerable or covert narcissist. Historically, and even recently, our image of a narcissist is somebody who's a grandstander, of somebody who is arrogant, who sucks all the attention, who thinks they're great, who is very entitled. You know exactly the image I'm putting forth. Everyone knows someone like that, okay? But what gets challenging is a lot of people out there, people like Stam and Miller and Pincus, the people doing some really important work in the narcissism research community. It's almost two faces of a coin. Some people are more grandiose narcissists, but every narcissist has a covert or vulnerable underbelly, and every vulnerable narcissist has a grandiose underbelly. It's like you're more one than the other, but you got the other one hiding. Now, the covert narcissist is characterized much more by a sense of almost constant injury. They are much more socially anxious. They are more sullen. They're more resentful. They feel very victimized. It's a much more victimized form of narcissism. I never got what I deserved. The world never noticed how great I am. You know, I'm going to show them one day. I'm going to get revenge on them one day and show them how great I am. People should be punished. People should suffer that I'm not at the top. It's very vindictive in that way. And that vindictiveness is about a sense that life never gave them what they deserved. As you can imagine, in some ways, being in a relationship with a grandiose narcissist, while very abusive, at times can almost be fun, right? They're the life of the party and there's all of that. With a covert or vulnerable narcissist, it's a lot less fun. They're much more socially awkward. They don't like having that level of social scrutiny because they always feel that they're not measuring up to other people. Remember that the core of narcissism is insecurity and feelings of inadequacy. So it's a very different kind of a relationship. Now, the techniques for dealing with either kind of narcissism are always the same. Have realistic expectations, Engage in radical acceptance, recognize these are rigid patterns that don't change, set boundaries, don't defend yourself because it's going to go nowhere, don't explain yourself, they're not listening, don't engage with them too much because it's always going to end up becoming into a big gaslighted mess, and don't personalize it. It really is them, even though it feels personal. However, if you're in a relationship with a covert or vulnerable narcissist, it's very tempting to want to try to rescue them because they definitely present as much more anxious, sometimes even have a very depressive feel. They really push themselves as victims, so you almost buy it and say, well, let me help them out, let me give them some money, let me introduce them to someone who can help them get a job, let me give them my car, let me tell them how great they are, let me keep encouraging them. And what ends up happening is you almost feel like you're just shoveling supply into their vulnerable soul, getting absolutely nothing back. And they're constantly kind of stomping around, feeling like life is never fair. And so it is a more depleting relationship. It's a more exhausting relationship, but you don't want to get into the pattern of feeling like you need to be their therapist, because that's a very easy kind of path to fall into. With the grandiose narcissist, and this actually applies to the covert narcissist as well, not every day is terrible. And that's actually one of the things that's most confusing about narcissistic relationships. If every day was awful, I think a lot more people say, okay, I'm done. But you have those days. You have that really nice dinner out. You have that really good conversation. You see the smile light up their face. You're like, that's the person I first noticed. They'll get it right every so often just enough to keep you on the chain saying, well, we did have a fun time last Saturday night for 3 hours, and then they got mad at me, but it was probably my fault. So there's even rationalizations when things sort of start to fall apart. But with those little good moments sprinkled in there, person might say, I had a narcissistic father. However, boy, did I enjoy those 2 days of fishing every summer. It's very easy to have that euphoric recall and put a lot more weight on those good moments. And those good moments make it very difficult for people to say, enough. This abuse is intolerable. Throw the trauma bond in there. People who actually walk around the world feeling they deserve this abuse, or abuse is love. And you can see why these narcissistic relationships, whether with a grandiose narcissist or with a covert or vulnerable narcissist, and again, most of them are both, can get really, really complicated. So let's go to our next question. And the next question is, to what extent does the abuse affect, the narcissistic abuse, affect children in a family? StuffThatWorks data shows that 69% of children of narcissistic parents suffer from anxiety and 46% from depression. How is this related? I have to say that again, this is one of those moments when StuffThatWorks really showed me the data from this large group of people experiencing narcissistic abuse, to see that number of 69% suffering from anxiety confirmed everything not only myself, but every clinician working in the space had seen. As you can see, while anxiety and depression sort of lead the call, then we also see attention deficit. But I'm going to make this argument that attention deficit, because this is people sharing their experience, I'm guessing that a substantial part of that 33% who have the ADHD or reported ADHD, it was likely due to anxiety. Children who have narcissistic parents are often quite distractible in school, which is where ADHD gets detected, because they're confused about what's happening at home. They're anxious about going home and facing the criticism and the invalidation and the confusion. So I think that attention deficit is actually an anxiety symptom there. And then we see post-traumatic symptoms like the vigilance, the avoidance, the arousal, sometimes the social withdrawal. So let's talk about the anxiety piece though. When a child has a narcissistic parent, you are used to, again, chronic invalidation. You never know what parent you're going to get. You're often always trying to please them and never able to get there. There's often a lot of tension in the household. Children who grow up with at least one narcissistic parent often find themselves walking on eggshells. So the entire childhood is characterized by this sense of, I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to get them upset. And what does a child do? They blame themselves. Oh, if only I'd had my room clean. If only I didn't say that at the table. Sometimes the child will even get mad at other family members. Maybe they'll have a sibling who acts up a little bit more, which agitates the narcissistic parent. And they'll misplace their anger at their sibling for getting the narcissistic parent angry, because it's actually too terrifying for a child to recognize that the parent is horribly flawed and shouldn't be ruling the family through that much anxiety. As we can see in this graphic, that these are the people reporting this they're adults who are in narcissistic relationships. Okay, so it's an adult, they have a narcissistic partner who is their co-parent, and they're asking to talk about their children. And in this case, 70% of respondents said their child experienced some form of emotional abuse, such as being put down, insults, criticism, blaming, or scapegoating. This is the territory of a narcissistic parent. It is a child that is constantly on edge. How could that result in anything but anxiety or other negative mood symptoms like sadness or depression? So often, people, and it's so, first of all, not enough children get mental health intervention. We write it off as, oh, that's just kids being kids. And even when the child gets mental health intervention, very rarely will they pin it to that narcissistic behavior of the parent. And even if they did, we know the punchline to that: the narcissistic parent is not likely to change. So this child is forever caught in this cycle. Some of you may be wondering, hey, listen, I'm co-parenting with a narcissist. I don't want my kid to be anxious. First of all, at some point, there has to be radical acceptance. Your kid's going to be a little anxious. There's no dodging this one. It really is sort of a universal element, because not only does a child feel like they're walking on eggshells, they can sense the tension in the parental marriage. And if your child's a scapegoat, it's even worse. The child always feels like, well, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to please this parent. If you happen to have a child who's the golden child, they're watching another child maybe being scapegoated, that can also make children anxious. So just the triangulation in the family system. So the best you can do, sort of as a hedge against that, is be that place of empathy for your child. Be there, hear them, listen to their feelings. You never, ever, ever want to throw the other parent under the bus. That's just never good parenting, as much as you're saying, I just want them to know the truth about what this parent is about. Trust me, on their own time, they're going to figure that out as they get older. You also, though, do not need to give the child, number one, a false depiction of their other parent as a hero, nor do you want to gaslight your own child. So if your child says, why does dad come home and scream, I don't understand this? You never want to say to your child, your dad has a really busy job, he doesn't mean it. No, because he came home and yelled. That's not okay. And so what you have to say to your children, and sometimes I always say it always helps to give them sort of a 30,000 foot view. Instead of saying, you know, dad didn't mean it, again, which is very gaslighty. Who knows if dad meant it or not? The fact is they're having a real experience of something. Is to say, to check in on their feelings. Are you okay? How are you feeling? I'm so sorry that you're having to experience this. And that basically something like grown-ups are sometimes not really good with their emotions, and they inappropriately take them out on the people who aren't their targets. And so now you're talking about grown-ups. You see what I'm saying? So grown-ups, you're not saying your father or your mother, but you're kind of, again, that 30,000 foot view, which gives the child a frame of this behavior you're witnessing is not acceptable. And I don't care how much stress someone's under, this isn't okay. That's sort of the implicit meaning there, but it's being there, being steady, holding emotional space for them, never gaslighting your child. Some of that can help take off the edge. And I've got to tell you, over the years, I've worked with many, many people. And I have to say, for people who had one very narcissistic parent and one solid parent, the parent was enduring so much nonsense from having to co-parent with a narcissist, but they were present and loving and emotionally there. It really does become a hedge. I still see that those children would struggle with anxiety when they became adults, but they had solid good cores. They grew up to become empathic adults, kind adults, compassionate adults. So having a narcissistic parent for a child is not a psychological sentence. They're not always going to be in bad shape. There will be that anxiety, and we know, though, and go to StuffThatWorks, you'll see the data. There's actually a lot of good treatments for anxiety. So let's go to the next question. from your experience, how do people usually realize that they're in a narcissistic relationship? They feel as though they've entered the matrix. They are completely confused. They find that they're often making excuses. They are chronically justifying, but confused. They have a lot of self-doubt. Now I'll tell you this, and this is what's changed in the last 5 to 10 years in this game, especially in the last 5 years. There's more information out there about this. When I wrote my first book about narcissistic relationships, I think that came out in maybe 2015, there were very few books out there about this. People weren't using this word. Now there's a lot of information. You know, my own YouTube channel, if you go there, you'll see that there's hundreds of videos on this. So, and I'm not the only one doing this. So there's content out there. And so when we look at what's happening here, and you can see what I'm answering here is completely consistent with what StuffThatWorks found, people recognize these patterns weren't okay just by doing their online research. You know, like I said, going to YouTube channels like mine, reading other blogs and articles and websites. And then the second one, which actually I was happy to see, 42% of people said, someone stepped in and said, this isn't okay. This is a wake-up call to everyone, that if you see something in a friend's or dear person's life to you, that you kind of step in, and you don't have to say, hey, I think your wife's a narcissist. That's probably not going to land well. But I think the best way to do it is to approach someone and say, I'm a little worried. You know, I'm seeing this. Are you okay? That might lead your friend to kind of open up a little bit. Okay. So I do think that it's that having a support network becomes important. And what's so sad is a lot of people who are in narcissistically abusive relationships, they become socially isolated, right? They end up getting cut off from other people because that's what narcissistic people do. There's a very controlling element to these relationships, and they don't want their partners to hear other validating voices. So they'll cut people off from their families, or the narcissistic person will speak badly about their families, or they'll cut people off from their friends, or maybe even at times suggest that they don't work, or at least not socialize or have close relationships with their colleagues. And so I think that the things that have made people aware is that this doesn't feel right. And many of you have been there, right? It's the middle of the night and you're saying, I don't know what to do. And you type in partner doesn't listen and is really entitled and rageful. And if you put that into a search engine, I can all but promise you narcissism is going to come back at you. Probably one of my darned videos. You can see where people found, interestingly, the most useful resources about narcissism. If we put in the 51% from online articles and the 16% from YouTube, we're talking about almost 70%, right? Is coming from online sources. And then there's online support groups, which people typically find from this online articles and YouTube, and then other things like books. So this is stuff, ironically, a quiet revolution started in mental health, where this information wasn't coming from the therapist and sort of what we consider the traditional sources. It was coming online. And I will say, as a psychologist who's been working in this space, I've been working in this space for well over a decade. And one thing I noticed was that my clients would come in and they'd say, I've never heard this word. I don't understand what's happening. But after just 4 or 5 weeks, they're saying, you gave me a roadmap. I'm so angry I didn't know this 20 years ago, but now it all makes sense. And that's really what it does. Good psychoeducation, good information about narcissism and narcissistic abuse ends up becoming a roadmap. You may not like the drive, but you'll say, I get it. This was actually a pattern. I no longer feel crazy. And that's a lot of what the interventions for narcissistic abuse are, is to end the cycle of self-blame and recognize that what your partner is doing is as predictable as the sun rising in the east. And that predictability is actually somewhat reassuring to people. And not, I mean, it doesn't mean you want to be in it, but it's reassuring in that it's not me, it's actually this narcissistic pattern. So let's go to the next question. What behaviors do you think are the biggest red flags that indicate that someone might be dealing with a narcissist? There's quite a few. So I would, my favorite one might actually be the stress test. Okay. And the stress test is when we see how this person, this narcissistic person in your life behaves under conditions of stress, particularly frustration or disappointment. Basically, the narcissist can't get what they want. They can't get a seat at the restaurant they want. Something at work doesn't go the way they want. Watch how they behave under those circumstances. Are they able to contain their emotion? How do they speak about the other people involved? Are they very dysregulated and angry and reactive? Pay attention to that. It's interesting, if we look up here, some of the data that StuffThatWorks popped up, the number one thing a lot of people noticed was actually lying and deceit. The lying and deceit can come out in different ways. Sometimes it's hard to spot a person in a lie because you don't know, but the lies, they might tell you about why they're late. People might tell you lies about their backstory. They might tell you lies about different relationships they're having in their lives. They'll tell you lies about where they are and how they're spending their time. But it can take a minute, though, to catch them in their lies. And what's interesting is sometimes people will say years later, now they're stuck in the darn relationship, and say, oh my goodness, all that early stuff they said about maybe their employment history or ex-partners and everything was a lie. Then other things that come up in these in the StuffThatWorks data is something are controlling behaviors and gaslighting. So controlling behaviors are something that come out a lot in narcissistic relationships. One thing we'll often see in narcissistic relationships, not always, but we will see, is that they go too fast. It's all too intense in the beginning, okay? It's all too much. There's a lot of like, tell me everything about yourself. Tell me your greatest fear. Let's go on a vacation very quickly. This is a once in a lifetime. So I've never felt such a magical connection. And then you kind of go down to this sort of metaphysical rabbit hole, thinking like, this is my magical story. I should spend all my time. This is my once in a lifetime love story. That's what love bombing is about. But you'll also get a lot of this. A good morning text, a good night text, 25 texts in the middle of the day. How you doing? What you up to? Take a picture where you at. FaceTime me from where you're at. That's actually an attempt to sort of kind of pin you down. Make sure they're trying to figure out, are you where you say you're going to be? And if you say, I actually can't FaceTime, I'm in a public place, they'll say, really? What are you doing there? Who are you with? What do you, are you lying to me? Are you cheating on me? And that's a lot of their projection. They often project not just their insecurities, but their bad behavior on other people. That control can also come in other ways. There may be a request that a new partner move in with them very quickly, which is a terrible thing to do, because now you've given up the sense of independence you'd have from having your own space to reside in. They may compel you to have to move far away to where they are, saying this will be a great adventure, and before you know it, you're now far away from your supports. Things happen very quickly, and there can be a lot of control over who you spend time with, even control about how you present yourself to the world, how you dress, all of that. The number 3 thing that was on that StuffThatWorks graphic was gaslighting. Now, gaslighting is the denial of a person's reality, okay? And that's where a person you will have an experience and they will literally deny it. And they'll say things like, you're being too sensitive, that never happened, I never said that, you're making too big a deal out of this, I refuse to talk about this anymore. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, like my entire reality is being questioned. And there'll be a point in the relationship, and I always say this, when you get to a point in a relationship where you feel like I need to start recording these conversations, if not to play them back to them, just to play them back to myself so I know I'm not losing my mind, that's a great sense you're in a gaslighted narcissistic relationship. Because what happens is they'll say, I didn't say that. Be a great example. And then you'll scroll down all the gazillion texts because they text you too much. And there it is where they said it. Or maybe, okay, so we'll use that as an example. And then you go up to them and say, see, you said this. And if you do that to the narcissist and the gaslighter, you know what they'll turn around and say, oh my gosh, are you really that petty a person that you have to go? What are you, a lawyer? Is that what this is? You have to go find a little thing I said? Oh, little petty. And then they'll insult you, which is more gaslighting, because now they're not actually addressing that you brought this evidence, this information, which you shouldn't have to do in a relationship. If you record, it'll be the same thing. And in fact, they will be so offended. And you'll say, I'm recording because you deny everything you say. And then they distract. They take it in an entirely different direction about how you're an untrustworthy person because you felt the need to record a conversation. And they'll give you some nonsense. Don't you know it's against the law to record conversations? And you're thinking, I just want to feel like I'm in a realistic sort of space. But those things are big red flags. Then the other things would be, how do they respond to any form of feedback or criticism? Many people will say, like, gosh, it was going well. I thought this was the most interesting, compelling, kind of like fantastic person I'd ever met. And about 3 or 4 weeks in, I just made an offhanded comment to them. I'd say, "Oh my gosh, I love that you're wearing that shirt. That's so 10 years ago. It's cool." And the narcissist will be like, "What? What are you saying? What are you saying? You're saying I can't afford new clothes?" And they'll just go off and you'll say, "Oh my gosh, I actually loved the shirt on them, but I knew it was like from a different era and I thought they wore it well." Well, the narcissist will just go off and you'll start feeling like you can't give an ounce of feedback. You can't give a piece of criticism. You can't say anything. And that's when the eggshell walking starts. So all of those are great examples of red flags. I could go on for hours about the red flags, but let's just go on to the next question. What can I do if I feel that my life is in danger? So this is a big question that is definitely going to be sort of more jurisdictional, okay? So because I know that Stuff That Works reaches out into many, many countries and the laws and the rules are very different. If indeed you feel your life is in danger and it's safe for you to do so wherever it is you live, that you would need to contact whatever authorities would be appropriate to contact. In some places that might be law enforcement, in other places that might be a domestic violence program, but in some cases that might mean getting to a safe space with other family members or friends. But from Stuff That Works data and people who've experienced narcissistic abuse, you'll see that 64%, almost pretty much 2/3 of people said at some point in this relationship, they felt their life was in danger. And for some people, they say, listen, the relationship actually never got violent, but there was always this sense of menace, always this sense that this person will blow. And that fear is actually what would keep people in marriages. They'll say, this is going to be the most horrifically frightening divorce of my life. Like, I don't have the psychological bandwidth, the money, the resources, the supports to withstand this kind of attack on myself. And if you have kids, and the idea might be, if this goes all the way to the end and I'm left with nothing, I may not even be able to keep my own children. So many times people will say, I'd rather be under the same roof with my kids 24/7. So yes, they will feel their life is at danger. And even if it's not just their physical being, it's their mental health. They would feel like, as you can see here, that mercifully, in 75% of the cases, that the narcissistic person didn't actually try to kill them, but in 25%, they're like, there was an attempt to do this level of harm. It is very, very important, and you are absolutely welcome, for example, to even go to my website. We have a bunch of, my Dr. Ramani website, we have a bunch of domestic violence resources. Stuff I'll work, certainly I'm sure the Stuff That Works can create that space too, where they're making those resources known to people, because I think that's really important. And that because domestic violence resources are so nation specific, it becomes almost impossible to create an exhaustive list. So it becomes very, very important that if you can, to discover what resources exist through nonprofits, NGOs, or other authorities in where you are. Safety is a major issue in these relationships. Is there a safe place to go? If there's some way you can even have a little bit of money set aside, so you've got it, if you need a place to go for a night, or just a bag of something quickly that you can grab, so you have clothing and some basic information. And like I said, the domestic violence world it does a much, much better job of saying, like, what needs to be done for safety, even in terms of keeping documents, copies of documents, pictures of documents in a place that if you did need to get out of a situation, you could at least do so with the basic information you would need. So it's a big, big question, and where obviously if your life is in danger, you should absolutely be getting to acute, immediate help. If you yourself feel that this situation has become so dangerous for you that you feel like you're starting to sort of feel like you may harm yourself, it's absolutely crucial you get yourself to emergency health services. and contact whatever emergency services exist where you are in the United States. That's the equivalent of calling what we call 911, or going to your nearest emergency room. If you're in therapy, contacting your therapist, who would then instruct you to do the same. So if we go to the next question, and I think next question. Okay, one thing we could also start doing soon is answering your questions. I think we're coming to that time, so we're coming into our last 10 minutes here. So I have my team here, graciously, who's been monitoring your questions, and they're trying to grab some of them up for me to answer. So in this first question, how do you overcome the love you have for that narcissistic person? Many people struggle with this particular question. How do I overcome this love? You have to view it. I mean, you don't have to do anything. I'm going to be the last person telling you what to do. I suggest that you view this as a process of grief. Many people feel a sense of shame for saying, what is wrong with me that I love this person? You love this person. Don't judge that. I feel like the capacity for human love is one of the most healing, forces in our life. And just because you love someone who's not good for you, do not devalue your capacity for love. Remember what people do in narcissistic relationships. They tell themselves a story. They justify, and they fill in all those holes. They didn't mean it. They had a bad childhood. They're under a lot of stress. They just want what's best for us. It does mean that you have to retell the story through a new lens. It also means that you can have loved someone, but also recognize that this relationship is no longer good for you. And it takes a minute. This is why I know that my suggestion on making those lists like that is that ick list of everything that's gone wrong. For some people, it seems small-minded. It's actually not. At some point, you need a reminder of, I went into this. I loved the best I could. This shows me this was not healthy for me. And that helps some people say, okay, I can let go of this. A lot of people say this love, I feel like I've got to go back in and fix it. That's the trauma bond talking, right? That's the child who had that sort of negating, rejecting parent in childhood where they're like, I'm going to win mommy over. I'm going to win, daddy over. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And they can't. They can't, because that parent's just not going to notice them. That's the nature of these narcissistic relationships. And so I think that idea of, I remember once using this term with somebody, trying to master the narcissist. I'm going to finally win them over. When people say I need to overcome this love I have for them, in some ways it's overcoming the fantasy that you're going to win over the unavailable parent. And that's really what it often comes down to. And it's the fantasy that you're finally going to win over the unavailable narcissist. I'm not so sure how much that's love as much as it's a playing out of the fantasy from childhood. It takes time, but view it as grief. Okay, view it as grief. And although the person's not dead, you're having to let go of this relationship and sort of release it. And it takes time. And do not shame yourself for saying, how can I be so foolish as to love someone who is not good to me? Your love is good. That person simply wasn't able to cherish it with the way it should have. So next question. Can people have narcissistic tendencies and not be full narcissists? Heck yeah. I mean, we all have friends like that, right? Like, God, this person just talks about themselves and they're kind of really selfish. But I have to say, in the midst of all that, when my mom was sick or my dad was sick or my sister was sick, they did come over and they were okay. And then an hour in, they were still chatting about themselves, but there was something lovely about their willingness to make the time. So, in the past, I've called these folks benign narcissists. If anything, that these people have the narcissistic tendencies and are not full-blown narcissists, they're very emotionally immature. They tend to be superficial. They tend to be egocentric. They tend to hijack the conversation. They tend to need a lot of attention. They're like a child who needs a lot of attention at an adult dinner party, and they keep cartwheeling through the living room. You're saying like, oh my gosh, what a pain in the neck, but it's a kid. And that's what these are. The problem is that they're not really kids, they're adults. So if you're trying to have a relationship with someone like this, it's going to be quite limited. And so this word narcissist, it's not diagnostic. A lot of people say, whoa, you shouldn't call them a narcissist because that's a diagnosis. It's not a diagnosis. Narcissistic personality disorder is a diagnosis. It's a diagnosis we see in somewhere between 2 and 5% of clinical populations. It does need to be given by a licensed mental health practitioner. It sometimes takes 8, 10, 12 weeks or longer to spend that much time with someone to really get it. And it doesn't really matter. What matters is these patterns aren't good for us, and they're on a continuum. At the mild end, you have these sort of egocentric, immature, attention-seeking dinner party cartwheelers. At the extreme end of severe malignant narcissism, you have people who are manipulative and exploitative and cruel. So there's a continuum. And yeah, there's people out there with narcissistic tendencies. Kind of fun to have at a party. Definitely not the person you're probably going to take your problems to. Let's take a look at one more question here. Why do I feel bad for the narcissist? It's a great question. And a really great question, actually, because you have empathy, because you have compassion. And the one thing I always want most for survivors is that you don't lose that, because your empathy and your compassion are gifts. And a lot of people feel like they were bled out by these relationships, that they have nothing left to give anymore. And they feel like, I'm going to lose that. And please don't lose that. They are the gifts that all of us need. Me, you, the world needs your empathy and compassion. So you feel bad because you have empathy. Now, here's the challenge. At the core of it, as I've described narcissism, it's all this arrogance, entitlement, grandiosity, lack of empathy, all of that. Those are their defenses. The core of the narcissist is somebody who's very vulnerable, fragile, who is insecure, and has chronic feelings of inadequacy right under the surface, right? So they're very fragile people. And as a result of their fragility, as it were, I feel bad for them too. And in fact, 1/3 of my clinical practice is with narcissistic clients. And every week I get in there and I do the best work I can. And I try to be that consistent presence in their lives. It's hard. We make tiny baby steps, whereas my clients who are not narcissistic are making these huge leaps. There's a limit. There's a rigidity there. Feeling bad, I'm fine with that. Let's call it feeling compassion. Here's where I don't want you to go with that. That doesn't mean that your life has to become a human sacrifice in the name of that pity. You can feel bad. You can understand where this comes from, but you have to, again, you should engage in that radical acceptance that this pattern isn't going to change. So you can have that empathy, you can have that compassion, you can even have that pity. You being kind to them is a human thing to do, but it's not going to result in change. So don't allow that feeling bad to translate into enabling their behavior. And please also don't allow that feeling bad to turn into self-blame. If only I did more, they'd feel better. There's nothing you can do. Not you, not me, not you, not anyone. That's on them. They're adults. We have to take responsibility for that. They can go get into therapy and they can go do the deep dive into this stuff. And the day they stop feeling that the world owes them something and that they're entitled to something special, maybe they'll be that, what I call the narcissistic unicorn. Some people actually go all the way into the deepest, darkest depths of their soul, do the work, and they create some significant change. I haven't seen a lot of it in my career. Most people haven't. So the micro changes usually aren't enough, but that feeling bad piece, don't enable, but allow that part of you that's empathic and kind to be there. So I think we're coming to the end of our time here. I want to say one more time, I want to thank StuffThatWorks for putting this live together, for pulling these questions, for working with the community. I hope this also turns you on to their site, StuffThatWorks.health. They're gathering data, and you can also see the data they've gathered on a bunch of chronic conditions and see what works for people, what doesn't work for people. And it's not just about narcissistic abuse. There's a whole host of chronic health conditions represented there. We know that chronic health issues are actually probably the biggest sources of morbidity certainly in the United States and in the rest of the world, in terms of costs, in terms of mental health impacts, just in terms of the impact on quality of life. So I hope this has given you answered some of your questions on narcissistic abuse. I know it's a very fraught space, and more than anything else, I hope that all of you can slowly set yourselves free, practice self-compassion, and understand this isn't you. that sometimes all you did was bring the best of yourself to someone with the best of intentions, carrying some of those heavy loads of childhood. Everyone out there is not just enough. You're more than enough. Please stop taking the best of yourself to people who can't see it. Thanks again. I'm Dr. Ramani.